Hi, my name is Sherry Norfolk, and I am a storytelling teaching artist. So let me tell you a story. Not too long ago, and not too far away, I was sitting in a pre-planning meeting for a kindergarten residency. There were 3 classes of children who were typically developing, and 1 class of children with disabilities. The teacher of the children with disabilities said, "Well, I don't think they're going to get anything out of it, but they might like the stories." Well, we had a 10-day residency, and every day I taught the children a different story. Sometimes we acted it out in the full group, and then smaller groups and smaller, until finally I was teaching them a story that they would tell individually. That story was The Great Big Enormous Turnip, and it has a sequence of 7 characters. Well, I taught it kinesthetically and visually and orally and auditorily and lots of other ways. And finally, it was time for them to get in partners and tell the story to each other. So all the children partnered up except Jeremy. Jeremy had fetal alcohol syndrome, and he was sitting right at the feet of his teacher all by himself. I looked around and saw Jeremy sitting there, and I went straight over and said, "Jeremy, you want to tell me the story?" And his teacher rolled her eyes and shook her head. And I thought, I am not going to let Jeremy sit here by himself. So I sat down in front of him and said, "Jeremy, tell me the story." Well, a long moment ensued, and then he started. "Once upon a time, there was old man. He planted seed. It grew. It grew. He say time to pull. He pull. He pull." Jeremy told that entire story with that sequence of 7 perfectly in sequence. I got the group back together and said, who would like to tell the story to the whole group? And a little girl did. And then before I could even ask for the next volunteer, Jeremy was up, walking to the front of the group. He stood there and told that whole story perfectly, adding details that time. At the end of the residency, we were supposed to have a big show for the Arts Commission that had funded the project. And so I talked to the teachers about what stories we were going to tell and who was going to perform those stories. And nobody mentioned Jeremy. So finally I did. I said, I would like for Jeremy to tell his story. And his teacher said, "No, don't do that to him. He can't retain the story that long." So I said, well, then let's have the whole class tell the story together. And she agreed. And that's how we rehearsed it. On the big day, it was time for that class to tell their version of The Great Big Enormous Turnip. So I got them up in front of the group, got them lined up, and then checked with them, as I always do, to make sure they knew what part they were playing. But when I got to Jeremy, he said, "I's the old man." Well, that's not how we rehearsed it, because the old man is the narrator of the story. But I said, okay. I put Jeremy up front. I moved off to the side because I could narrate from there if I needed to. I said, "Jeremy, tell us the story." "Once upon a time, there was old man. He wanted turnip. He got seed. He dug, he planted, and the sun came down." Not only did he tell the story, he added details. And he directed the story. When it was time for the old woman, he reached out and grabbed her and pulled her into place. When the story was over, his teacher pulled me aside. She said, his IEP, his individual educational plan, said that all he could learn was how to flush and zip and wipe. But obviously, he can learn. I'm going to have him retested. His entire educational career has changed as of this day. That was a light bulb moment for me as well as for his teacher. That's what radical welcoming is. And that's what my passion is, to always find ways to radically welcome children to the world of storytelling. In St. Louis, Springboard to Learning, a Young Audiences affiliate, has been working under contract with the VSA Kennedy Center to deliver arts integrated residencies to children with profound special needs. As the leading teaching artist in this project, I have had the privilege of working with hundreds of children, kindergarten through 12th grade, with a vast variety of profound special needs. They and their amazing teachers have taught me so much, and I have so much more to learn. But there are some things that I've learned that I'd like to share with you. We need to provide access, the ramps and the closed captioning and the sign language. But more than that, we need to provide inclusion. It's not enough to have the children sit in the room where the music is happening. We have to involve them in making the music. It's not enough to tell a story. They need to be part of the storytelling. And so I work really hard at trying to invent ways to include children in the art. When a child is unable to speak, unable to move, she is trapped inside her body. We have to find a way to bring her out. Because that contract with the VSA Kennedy Center has been ongoing since 2015, I've been able to work with the same children year after year. In one class, there was a girl named Amy. When I first met her, Amy could talk, and she had the use of both hands a little bit. She had an electric wheelchair, and she could manipulate the controls. By the second year, she had lost most of her ability to talk and the complete use of one hand, but she could still manipulate the wheelchair. By the third year, Amy could not speak at all, and she only had the use of one finger. But Amy could growl, and she was really good at it and loved to do it. So she liked to be the troll when we did the Three Billy Goats Gruff, and she loved to be the lion when we acted out the Lion and the Mouse with puppets. One day, I got out the Lion and the Mouse puppet, and I said, Amy, are you going to be the lion? Big grin. But the lion puppet is big and heavy. There was no way she could hold it. Now, in that same class was a boy named Ethan. Ethan had autism, and he spent his entire day, every day, walking in circles around and around and around the class. But Ethan saw what the problem was going to be. And he walked over to Amy and said, I'll be your lion. And he picked up the lion puppet and he held it right next to Amy. And he manipulated the lion and she got to growl. You could see that he wanted to growl in the worst way, but he didn't. He allowed her to do that. So radical welcoming allowed him to step out of his self-isolation and do something compassionate and collaborative with a fellow student. So does radical welcoming through the arts always work? In my experience, yes, eventually. Probably not the first time or the second time or the third time even that you work with the kids, but if you are consistent and persistent, if you're observant, watching to see what works and what doesn't. And when something doesn't work, figuring out why and seeing if you can fix it. And when something does work, figuring out why and doing it more and more and more. I was working with a class of children with profound disabilities, and it was the very first time. And I had tried all of the extrasensory kinds of things that I use, scarves and instruments and puppets, and no response. They sat in their wheelchairs with their heads down. Finally, I was telling Itsy Bitsy Spider, and when he goes down the water spout, I use the rain stick. Well, I hold it where the child can see it even with his head down. And his head came up. and his eyes came up, and he met my eyes. We made contact. I tried that with every kid, and it worked with every single kid. And then I found a zillion different ways to use the rain stick, because if I'm going to find a way to make contact, I'm going to use it. But I also had to figure out why it worked. For one thing, it's very, very colorful. It's got lots of sensory input, not just the sound, but the movement and the colors. And if I can do hand over hand when it's happening, we can feel the vibration of the movement as well. Also, it was within his range of vision, so he could see what was happening, and he looked up to see where it went. So being persistent, being observant really works. Teachers tell me that kids with disabilities typically do not have a chance to interact with the other kids in their class. They are working on their own IEPs with their own teaching assistant. But when the arts come into a classroom, that paradigm shifts and changes. I worked in a school in Tennessee over a period of 5 years. And one year, when I first started working there, I started hearing about a little boy named Nick. Nick was a kindergartner, and he had brittle bone disease. He also had a brain tumor that was inoperable. He couldn't come to school very often because he was often in pain. Even though I was in the school a lot, I didn't get to meet Nick for many months. But one day when I walked into the office, everybody was excited. Nick was going to be in school that day, and I was scheduled to be in his classroom. It was a kindergarten classroom, and as odds would have it, I was using the story, The Great Big Enormous Turnip, that Jeremy excelled so much at. Well, I got to meet Nick. I told the story about the great big enormous turnip, and when we were ready to act it out, Nick wanted to be the old man. Now, the children knew very, very well that they could not touch Nick or even get close to him because he was so fragile. So they devised their own way to act out the story with no touching, no jostling, no chance of harming Nick. And they told that story with him with so much happiness and joy that we did it again. And the entire session was being videoed. When it was over, I was so happy. He was so happy. And the teacher said he'll have to leave pretty soon. He's getting really, really tired. And he did leave about an hour later. And he never returned to school. He died about 2 weeks later. But after that, his classmates asked for that video every day for months. And they would sit and smile and remember when they got to play with their friend Nick. That story and being able to tell that story together broke through the isolation for all of them. So radical welcoming, it welcomes students to come out of their isolation, to break through, to make contact with the world, and to know that their contribution is valued.